Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to take a few moments while everyone connects. While we wait, you're welcome to put your name and your organization in the chat box and introduce yourself. Our co-chairs and speakers, I would welcome you to do so as well if you're comfortable.
I'm Santiago Sedaka. I'm with DT Global. Agnes?
Agnes Dasevich, former CEO of SID.
Awesome. All right. I think let's go ahead and begin. So today's event, Putting the Pieces Together, How Development Practitioners Facilitate Investment Addressing Climate Change, has been hosted by the Development Finance Workgroup. Before I turn it over to our co-chairs to introduce themselves and our speakers, I want to briefly introduce myself and SID-W. My name is Malva Karvandive, and I am a program coordinator for SID Washington. And for those that might not be familiar with SID Washington, we are the largest and most active chapter of the Society for International Development, an international network that was founded in 1957 to serve as a global forum dedicated to sustainable economic, social, and political development. We serve as a global town square for the international development community, bringing together people from diverse organizations, disciplines, and career stages in a neutral, independent forum to share information and discuss important issues and challenges facing our community. And today is an example of that. There are different ways that you can get involved with us. You can check out our upcoming events on SIDW.org. Currently, our biggest upcoming event is our conference on May 26th, and we hope to see you there either virtually or in person. You can sign up for a weekly newsletter also on our website, or you can follow us on social media and see what we're up to. A few things to note for today. We will be recording this session and we will be sharing it publicly through our networks and social media channels. Live translation closed captioning is available, and I will be enabling that now. And you can turn that on from your individual settings. If you have any questions, please make sure to post them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Apologies for the confusion. We have a Q&A and chat box. We want to make sure that the questions come in the right box. And in the interest of time, the speakers may not get a chance to answer all questions. And finally, before I turn it over, we have a quick poll that I want to launch just to kind of understand who our participants are and where you're joining us from today. I will keep that open for a few seconds. And while we wait and while we participate in this, we will also be sending in an event survey towards the end of this event. And this survey is just for you to provide us feedback on how the event was and what you thought about it, and ways that we can improve our events for in the future. All right, I think I will close this and share. So I do see that it's kind of a split between members and non-members. Welcome and thank you for, if you're a member or non-member, thank you for being here today. And I do see that a lot of participants are joining from the DC area, but also from outside the DC area. So yeah, thank you for your time, and we hope that you enjoy this event. And with that, I will now turn it over to Santiago Sedaka, who is one of our co-chairs for the Development Finance Workgroup.
Thank you. Welcome to the first SID Washington Development Finance Committee meeting of 2022. I'm one of the co-chairs along with Agnes Diswicks. The purpose of the committee is to have practical discussions about trends and practices in development finance, particularly as it relates to broader development challenges. Historically, the people who show up to these meetings are either finance specialists or development specialists who understand the importance of finance in order to address the challenges that we're all working to address. This year, we decided to start with a topic that is in everyone's mind, climate finance. And the reason is that the task in front of the world is enormous. The Green Bank Network estimated that bridging the climate financing gap would require an additional between 166 to 322 billion per year based on current investment estimates. And the world is already investing hundreds of billions of dollars addressing climate change. Many of the reports that one reads from the World Bank, various think tanks, and advocacy organizations will correctly focus on several important things that need to happen at the macro level in order to correctly and adequately and quickly address climate change. From setting up and improving carbon markets to developing global standards for better measuring financing flows to debt forgiveness, perhaps, or restructuring debt so developing countries can repurpose resources into climate change needs. Most of us here, however, don't set high-level policy, but we do get to work on regulatory, business strategy, or water and energy programs that still affect the trajectory of economies. So my personal belief is that when we demystify the huge challenge of climate finance, we can actually have an important impact using the tools and working with the actors that we already know how to work with. We are trying to solve other important challenges, such as addressing food insecurity, COVID recovery, or creating more inclusive economic systems. What I'm saying is that most of us at SID already have the opportunity to work with developing country ministries, which signal national policy priorities, private industry actors that have to develop and find attractive rates of return for risky projects, financial institutions from banks to pension funds that need to fund the opportunities, and business and finance leaders who need the help oftentimes of business service providers to develop the projects at scale that are needed. Today, we'll probably hear about the challenge of multiplying private sector finance for climate solutions. We'll probably talk about the different opportunities in mitigation, adaptation, and dual purpose investments. The fact that most green finance by far takes place in developed countries, and the developing countries suffer from lack of investable projects at scale. As Agnes leads us through the conversation with these real development thinkers that we have around us and practitioners, I hope that we not only are able to identify the challenges that are around us and in front of us, but we can think about some of the strategies and approaches that are being used right now to hopefully get us to already change the way in which we do our work again right now. So we have with us Agnes Dazowicz, who's the former CEO of SIF. She has worked at the Kaufman Foundation and at Rockefeller Foundation, and previously she was at USAID, where she was behind some of the most significant accomplishments in development finance, including the launch of Power Africa and the establishment of the Office of Private Capital. We also have with us, to my left in my panel, upper left, Rick Nogueira, who's an expert on climate finance, international development, and sustainable investing. He's got all kinds of clients, including philanthropies, governments, and development banks. He's part of the DC's Green Finance Authority and is also a member of the Green Climate Fund Independent Technical Advisory Panel, or ITAP. He has worked under President Obama's administration as climate finance advisor in the US Department of State and spent 10 years in private sector fund management prior to that. We also have Matthew Pegon, who joined IDB Invest in 2017 as head of blended finance. He leads the development of IDB Invest concessional finance resources in high impact projects where risks are too high for commercial finance alone. His team has channeled over 500 million of concessional capital in 80 projects, unlocking over 5.5 billion of investments that contribute to sustainable development goals in the Paris Agreement. He previously worked at the Green Climate Fund and at BNP Paribas. And finally, we have with us Sashi Jayatileke, who's a senior climate finance advisor with USAID's Center for Energy, Environment, and Infrastructure. She leads coordination and provides technical guidance on climate finance to the interagency and to USAID countries working to mobilize finance for climate goals. She joined the US government as a presidential management fellow in the Development Credit Authority at the time, And previously, she worked on technical support and consulting in economic development and financial inclusion with USAID implementing partners. You can see my bio on the SID site. I've been in the trenches working on inclusive finance for many years in about 40 countries. I've worked at Corana Palladium, where I helped set up the $250 million USAID Catalyze platform. And now I've been working at DT Global for the last year and a half, where we are quickly expanding to becoming one of the largest implementing partners in the world in the development space. So with that, Agnes, over to you.
Thank you so much, Santiago. And I really want to thank our panelists for joining us today. And let's jump right into questions in this important discussion. So to all of you, I wanted to pose kind of a framing question and allow each one of you to say a few words about how you think about this. In terms of delivering finance and facilitating investment, what are some of the factors and considerations that distinguish developed markets from less developed countries? So I will start with that question with Rick. You're the first one on my screen there, so I'll start with you. Sure,
thank you, Agnes. I would broadly look at three different things, and I'm in a fortunate position, I think, because I've, as Santiago mentioned, I've been in fund management and have managed both an investment vehicle that was exclusively focused on developing markets and another one on developed. And when I look back on that experience, and I think it still holds true today, there are maybe three areas that jumped out as being very different. So one is the robustness of the intermediation space in developed markets compared to developing markets. And what I mean by that is, if you show up in a developed market with a pot of money saying, here's my goals, here's my remit, it's, you're waving a red flag to a huge community of service providers and pretty sophisticated intermediaries that are either in the banking sector or they're co-financers or they're financial institutions. And you're stepping into a world that's, pretty well mapped out. Products and investment opportunities will come to you. They will be thought through, they'll be fleshed out. So it makes your life much easier than my experience in developing countries, where the amount of intermediators, let's say, that are connecting funders and investors with actual projects and helping those projects look reasonable to an investor are fewer and far between. And that makes your level of effort and time commitment as an investor go up, which impacts kind of the returns that you're going to then expect in terms to make up for that time and effort. And when you do find opportunities that are pretty robust and have kind of high quality teams and intermediaries around them, you'll find yourself in a more auction-like scenario because everybody ends up chasing those very few projects. And then they make them less attractive, and then maybe you have to compete with the two and the MDBs when they show up for those projects, as well. So that's one thing. There's just a different scale of the size of intermediary space. You also notice the lack in developing countries of early stage sources of capital. So VC communities, private equity communities are not as robust as you find in developed countries. And in that case, you almost feel like many of the projects and opportunities you look at, they're in perpetual Series A mode. And again, it takes a lot more work. You have to be much more hands-on. Often there's a lack of that other co-investor that you can bring in or that has already been in the project before you get there, that maybe has some special sectoral knowledge or local knowledge. That's often lacking in these markets. And I should say, when I talk about developing countries, it's a spectrum, right? So there's, some countries have more of that than others, but this is, with a broad brush, I would describe that. And then the third area that jumps out, and I'll keep this one short, is what falls broadly under the category of enabling environments. We found in our experience there's less clarity of outcomes in countries, and that brings you a little bit more risk, and that impacts the risk-adjusted returns you'll need. And that's everything from, can you enforce your contracts and your rights effectively and pragmatically, right? So loss may exist on the books, but do you have a legal judicial system that's going to give you an outcome in a reasonable period of time, or is it going to be a 10-year process, which ends up being meaningless from an investor standpoint? Is the judicial system going to respect the rights of outsiders? Is it how politicized it is? And it's not just the process, but then even whether there is a level of flexibility in the local law and the local environment that allows you to do things that may be common in developed countries and non-developing countries. For instance, things like, even things that seem pretty simple, like convertible debt, or what kind of security package you can put around assets, or getting cross guarantees from other parties. In many markets, those are actually kind of de novo, or they don't have like a long track record in history that you can rely on. So either it leads you to more kind of simplified approaches that come up with other risks, you got to price that in, or the lack of clarity, you also have to price that in, making it a much more challenging environment.
Great, thank you. That's a really great summary. Sashi, do you have anything to add to that?
I might just add that in addition to how Rick laid out the intermediation issue, we can look at a little bit deeper on what that means specifically in terms of tools. And implicitly, I think, Rick, you're also talking about de-risking tools, everything from what we might offer through the Development Finance Corporation for loans or guarantees, but also where donors like USAID could provide technical assistance and grants to enable governments and project sponsors. I think to be able to bring to bear, the investment worthy deals that we hear is not meeting the supply of finance that's out there. There is this intermediation that's needed, but there is a way for us to fix that by thinking carefully about where we can help governments to prioritize projects that have climate benefits, and then looking at, again, grants that target technical and legal documentation. Another area that I think we've learned in the last few years and just broadly working in finance, and that we'd like to bring to bear to climate, is instead of working one-off with investors in one country or one region, we need to standardize and scale strategies. And this is harder to do because, well, our agency's earmarked. That said, if we only cut across sectors, both renewable energy, natural climate solutions, adaptation, will we actually find scale that meets, the demand that we're hearing is out there from institutional investors? And so to do that, we need to look at collaboration with investors, convening with investors, and mixing different forms of debt and equity in order to structure funds and vehicles that are at the hundreds of $million range and not just the double digits. And just two other things I would mention that I think is important is that we do need to help investors price risk appropriately. And that's partly because there's a lack of data right now that institutional investors and larger funds don't have access to. And if the data is out there, it's not exactly clear what's the data that's needed for them to be able to invest. So we'd love to increase that in a way that is more transparent, as well as how credit rating agencies conduct their rating methodologies in order to reduce country, the perception of country risk. And to Rick's point on enabling environment, I think that's like where we see USAID could add a lot of value, but also many other partners out there that can not only work on the business enabling environment, but again, working with subnational entities and convening them together to facilitate investment.
That's great. I mean, I think what you just kind of mentioned is that there are two different ways of kind of approaching it. One is kind of transaction specific tools, like you mentioned, guarantees, but also OTA around specific transactions. But also what you have is you have these systemic tools, right? That are much more around credit ratings, around setting standards, around pricing risk appropriately. So I think it's important to note that there are kind of two levels of tools. So thank you for kind of bringing that discussion to the forefront. Matthew, I think, it would be great to see, first of all, in Latin America, where you're now focused, what are some of the factors and considerations that distinguish developed markets from LDCs? And then we can continue into more of the approaches to help do that, to help address that.
Thanks, Agnes. I don't know that there is a specific distinction. You know, it's really part of a continuum at the end of the day. And even if you look at an area like Latin America and the Caribbean, this is a region with a lot of heterogeneity, not only between countries. You know, you have countries like Haiti and countries like Chile, but also within the countries. You know, this is the continent with the highest level of inequality. And this is not only social inequality, but also spatial inequality. So if you look at a country like Brazil, for example, there's a lot of differences between one state to another. And perhaps, you know, one of the defining marker of the region is really this idea of inequality. Now, and to bring it back to what Rick and Sashi was saying, at the end of the day, it really boils down to institutional capacity in a broad sense of the term. So it's not just the rule of law, but it's also, you know, sophistication of the financial system and whatnot. And the way it sort of trickles down in the area that I cover, which is a private investment, is really twofold. One is coordination failure. And so, you know, to take an example in climate finance, you know, you could have this a very nice government framework that encourages the financing of renewable energy, but then there's no local commercial bank willing to do that financing. And so effectively, I think one characteristic of developed countries is that even if you try to fix one link within the chain, then there's other links within the chain that can prevent you from succeeding. And, you know, it's just one link and the entire chain breaks. The other one is information failure. And we do see a lot of that in developing market in general, where, you know, you could have models that are on the paper very workable. So, you know, you could have an agroforestry model that can at the same time result in reforestation and the production of crop that generate positive cash flow. But because of this lack of knowledge and lack of information in the different actors in the chain, that investment does not occur. And really, when you think about the use of concessional finance in private sector operation, which is what we do, it's really sort of trying to address those two issues. And to your point, it is transaction driven, but at the end of the day, the end game is more systemic. So it's not so much I'm trying to get that deal done, but rather I'm trying to generate enough knowledge by getting that deal done so that that knowledge eventually spills over throughout the production network, and then those investments happen on their own, you know, without any one of us being involved.
Can you, I mean, you've mentioned this concessional finance, so I wanted to kind of follow up on that and talk a little bit about it, because there's been a tremendous increase in the application of blended finance, which includes blending concessional, non-concessional resources together to really make deals happen. Can you say a little bit more about that tool and how it really helps in or not in crowding in private capital for both adaptation and mitigation? And really, you know, what is the potential that blended finance vehicles bring to climate finance?
Yes, thank Agnes. That's a good question, and you know, there is a bit of confusion in the market right now because you do read a lot about blended finance, and when you start getting into the topic, you realize that there's actually a lot of different conception of what blended finance is. So if you take the perspective of the development finance institution, which is sort of the perspective I work on with on a day-to-day basis. This is really about subsidizing the private sector. So, you know, we use the term concessional, which is perhaps less controversial, but, you know, at the end of the day, this is a public money that is being used to transfer an advantage to a private agent. I don't think there's really any difference between concessional blended finance and blended finance. It's rather more a magnitude of the subsidy that you're extending. And really, when you think about it that way, at the end of the day, it's really about how much am I getting in terms of social return and what is my cost in terms of taxpayers' money. And it's really as simple as that. Whether you're working in climate adaptation or climate mitigation. And so effectively, it means a couple of things. One is that when you look at the ratio between private sector financing or public sector financing, that only matters to the extent that you're changing one of those two variables. So leverage does matter if it decreases the cost for the taxpayers' money, or if it increases the impact that you get by crowding in private investment. But leverage per se doesn't tell you anything, and that's one thing I think we have to be a little bit careful when we speak about blended finance. The other thing is that blended finance, I think, in order to be catalytic, needs to work on the premise that at the end of the day, we're centering our efforts into what economists are going to call like private goods and services, or quasi private goods and services. So it's probably not a very good use of taxpayers' money to try to do blended finance to finance a pure public good like early warning systems, for example. And that means that when we think about blended finance, this is not the silver bullet to solve all the challenges of the Paris Agreement, but it does work well in a couple of instances. And in our mind, where it works the best in the context of climate finance is really those areas where you're looking at investments that ought to be fully financed by a private financier, but because there's a misperception of risk, or because there's a lack of demonstration effect, that investment effectively doesn't happen. And so that's condition number one. Condition number two, you need to target financings where the social returns of that financing exceeds the private return. And so what it means is that you need to find financing where, for one way or another, that financing, on top of being profitable for that person financing a wind farm, also generates common good. And so when you combine the two effectively, where it works the best is really looking at those goods and services that generate positive climate externalities, that have the potential to be more competitive than the high carbon or the non-resilient incumbent, but because there's a misperception of risk, that financing doesn't happen. And it works pretty well. And I'm going to give you a quick example. In 2015, we used concessional finance, $40 million to support the first 4 solar projects in Uruguay. With embedded grant equivalent of a couple of 100 basis points. So, this is fairly subsidized, and with no private capital in that financing other than the equity of the developer in the project. Now, 2 things happened which are very interesting. Is like a couple of years later, all those projects were refinanced fully on the private sector, and the rate of that financing was more attractive to the sponsor than the then subsidized rate. And what it effectively means is that the perception of the market had shifted in such a magnitude that it was more profitable for the developer to refinance or then concessional financing. And when you look at the impact in terms of big numbers and the total amount of capital that financed that asset class in Uruguay, that's $4.5 billion. And so if you put that in front of our $40 million, that's really where a blended finance is catalytic, and not so much in the leverage ratio that we had at the time where we did the transaction, which was 0. It was 100% public finance.
So it's a matter of really changing the perception, and the return is really the social return, plus the fact that you're driving in lots of private capital towards those same transactions that before were completely financed with concessional finance. So it's a huge success, and obviously you're setting the sector and the country on a very different trajectory. Rick, can you add to that? I mean, how can some of this concessional finance be used to really motivate private sector actors, because that's really the goal that we're all aiming for.
Yeah, I'm listening to Matil on that. One thing that struck me is, once those projects were refinanced, it really was happening at the local market level. Once kind of the actual risks were understood in the market, and people weren't trying to figure out the difference between perceived and actual risk. And I think that's one of the questions that's often in my mind, which is not only how do you try and mobilize capital from developed countries into developing countries, but how do you figure out how to mobilize capital that's already in those marketplaces, right? And that's something that I think is often under discussed, partly because it's a politicized question in the world of Paris. But if your focus is on climate impacts and on efficiency and effectiveness of your use of your money, then that needs to be part of the discussion, and you got to put aside the UNFCCC kind of perpetual bargaining around finance questions. And I often approach it by thinking about, what if climate change wasn't a reality? Would development still happen in these countries? Would things still get built? Would things still get financed? Will companies still need capital? And the answer is yes. And how would that have happened? It will be the way it's always happened, which has typically been local institutions and local sources of capital. So I think that's an area to focus on, is, what's the barriers that's keeping, particularly in the middle income countries where there are capital markets. And I'll note two examples, maybe three examples of useful information, hopefully. So one is, a couple of years back, I was part of a process where we went and talked to institutional investors in local countries, in about 10 different countries, all developing countries. And my big two takeaways were, one, there was a cultural shift that has started to happen in developed countries in the finance community that actually hasn't happened there yet, or is just starting. Where their perception was, oh, if it's green, if it's climate, that's for multilaterals, that's for international investors. That's not necessarily for us, because we have, pension obligations or whatever else they had. And so we rather, have an investment in a REIT in Miami, is always the classic example that people give. But it is true, like, there's a comfort around that, and have dollarized investments outside. So one, there still needed to be that kind of cultural shift. And then two, to Sashi's point, they would point to a lack of data or understanding of what actual risks were, even in their own countries. And one of the recommendations we often heard from them is that they need more listed products in local currency in their markets. Now, of course, we're talking about, upper middle income, right? Like developed countries. This is probably not going to be the case in a very small developing country. But that was a common theme we heard. I think there's probably a role for blended capital in that space, particularly where some of these listed products would be new. And the utility of it is they provide a kind of a mark-to-market tool for other investors. They bring transparency, so people can kind of better understand, and the market better understand what's actually happening in these spaces, and they can establish track record. So that's one kind of bit of feedback where I think it's an underdeveloped space. And I know there's some efforts already ongoing there, but there's probably room for more. A second kind of lesson, again, thinking about mobilizing, but in this particular case, developing country capital, is the success of efforts where investors or climate finance focused people took existing financial tools in countries and repurposed them for climate. And one example, which actually Matil's also very familiar with, he's did quite a bit of work on, is in Brazil, the FIDIC security. So Brazil has a particular security product that's often used to refinance credit card debt, student loans, very day-to-day sort of debt products. Institutional investors are very familiar with it. And there's been effort by different institutions to kind of take that model that brings a certain efficiency, some liquidity, some governance advantages, and some tax efficiency advantages, and repurpose it for climate efforts. And that's been very successful, because what happens is you're not recreating something that everybody feels they have to get educated on, but you're actually taking something that there's already quite a bit of comfort, and then thinking how you can kind of reuse it. And often there's a need for some blended capital in the first efforts, But what you'll find over time, which has been the case with some of the FDIC efforts in Brazil, is that in a very short period of time, you'll actually have local capital muscling out the concessional money because they realize this is actually a good thing and the returns are there. And I'll note another lesson I took away on that is one reason that it's useful to take things that the market already understands, is familiar with, is because when you're talking to the financial communities in developing countries, what you realize, very different than in developed countries, is they tend to be a smaller community. And if things don't go well for them personally, there is a human element to everything we do. They can't just go to the bank across the street, like as often happens in Europe, in the US. It is a much more risk-averse community for things that feel like innovation, because if you've made it to the pinnacle of your career and you're sitting in a financial institution in a developing country, there aren't that many kind of lateral moves left for you. So people are very much in kind of a protective mode. So I think you actually have to come into these markets with that understanding of how the psychology works. And that's where there's utility in blended finance, and kind of even where the financial risks may not be there, there are human cultural perception risks that you address, and also in the comfort of using something that's local. And then the last thing I'll touch on quickly, but maybe in another question I could come back to, is I've over time become a big believer in the role that green banks or local green or local finance institutions that have a specific remit around climate, and their role to be able to kind of move local markets for a variety of reasons, everything from the demonstration effect side, the ability to provide concessional finance, but in a way that really understands local needs, to be a partner with folks like IDB Invest and others. But there's space for that and for more of these sorts of institutions, whether they're new ones or whether you're helping existing development banks, institutions kind of build out that capacity. But that's an area where advisory efforts and relatively low cost efforts in terms of helping folks set those things up can really provide long-term benefits in terms of mobilizing capital.
That's great. I mean, it just really resonates with me. I remember when during Power Africa, we were trying to bring more institutional investors from Europe and the US to invest in energy on the continent. And we really couldn't move them until we started getting local institutional investors involved, because like you said, a lot of it is human and perception and psychological. And these, US pension funds would see a Southern African pension fund that's sometimes bigger than them investing in something, and they said, well, they're local, they must know more, and they're investing like us, right? So they're not an MDB that we know takes a lot of risks, right? They're an actual institutional investor, and it really gave them that comfort level that the transaction was better. So yeah, the role of private local investors is huge, and I think that's great that you brought that up. Let me bring up another topic though, because a lot of times these local institutional investors really want to make sure, because they're usually using the money of pensioners who live in their country. They really want to make sure that what's actually happening is there is economic development, and that everyone in the country is really equally profiting and benefiting from a lot of the investments that they're making. This is the same, in the US as it is in Africa and Latin America. So let's talk a little bit about this, because as we know, there's widespread recognition that climate change disproportionately impacts the poorest and the most marginalized communities. But yet it's really difficult to get private investment to really focus on those communities. So that there's usually political and financial systems that are often excluding or creating barriers to certain groups of people. And then that exacerbates their vulnerability and limits their ability to adapt to climate change effects that they're feeling. So maybe Sashi, I'll start with you. Can you speak a little bit to this? So, we focus a great deal on the role of the private sector, and it's really important that the private sector actually comes in and helps governments deal with climate change. And at the same time, in the climate strategy, USAID committed to supporting and here I'm quoting, supporting our partners to achieve systemic changes that increase meaningful participation and active leadership in climate action of Indigenous peoples, local communities, women, youth, and other marginalized or underrepresented groups. Hence, development organizations like USAID, IDB, and others are really playing a critical and central role to help ensure that scaled up investment contributes to social equity and inclusion goals. Can you elaborate, please, on some of the structural changes that you and other organizations, other similar organizations see with respect to ensuring access to finance for these groups, and how development programming can be used to address some of these really structural and systemic issues?
Yeah, that's a great question and not an easy one to answer. I think the main way that we have decided to approach this is to acknowledge that there is a lot of room to grow in this space. And that is shown in the strategy. As you noted, it is a cross-cutting strategy, which is not just limited to our environment sector anymore. And even our administrator now refers to the agency as a climate agency. And the evidence that the climate change is not just a global crisis that's affecting a few climate vulnerable countries is there. And we know that it could actually reverse all the work we've done in development across the last few decades. So for us to be able to respond to this challenge, this unknown impact coming down the pike and the adaptation needs, requires that the agency takes a whole of agency response. What does that look like in practice? It means that we're looking at how we can take long-term and transformative changes across sectors like agriculture, energy, governance, infrastructure, and even health. And so that first step was acknowledging this is a whole of agency approach that we took across the agency last year. This year, we are looking at how does that get implemented? Where are there examples to be more holistic? And how can we work with partners on the ground towards this more equitable world and more resilient world? So partnering with Indigenous people, local communities, women and youth, and marginalized populations is a huge part of the strategy. But the how is where we are looking for guidance and support on, because there isn't, really great examples out there of where we've married finance, equity, and justice. I'm actually going to a conference tomorrow to learn more about that because it is a big part of our job. It is a gap that we acknowledge we need help on, but we know if we don't acknowledge this gap, we'll never actually come up with solutions that are new. We don't want tried and tested things because there really isn't that much out there. When we looked at our portfolio, there's a couple of programs, and one is BioRed Plus in Colombia that was built on engaging local communities for decades, the indigenous populations in the Amazon there. The Althea Biodiversity Fund is an example of something that was developed after 2 years of consulting businesses in the Amazon about where there was opportunities to support the local communities. So another example is in Kenya that was developed after 10 years of working with pastoralists in grasslands. And so, I emphasize the importance of how long it takes, because to do this well, it takes community engagement. And that, of course, contradicts our urgent need to move finance today. And so that's where we understand there's, we're asking for a lot. But if we don't start building in community engagement in everything we do, we're risking our projects to be unsustainable and putting more people in poverty by shifting the balances of equity in certain countries. So there are a handful of examples. We're trying to share more of how those work, how we convene groups together in these markets, and then how we brought private investors in to then help provide additional economic development for those communities.
Yeah, let's kind of follow up on that, because it's a really, really great point, right? What you're basically saying is that a lot of the solutions need to be and are locally driven, right? They're locally owned, locally driven. especially in adaptation, right? So when you're talking about transforming sectors in agriculture and infrastructure and health, it's really about adapting those sectors to withstand, to be resilient to climate change. So I want to kind of turn to Matteo now, because, you know, most of the effective adaptation work has been locally driven and locally owned. And it's widely recognized that adaptation needs to be bottom up through small scale community driven projects with small ticket sizes. These smaller initiatives often do not match well with investment capital that's available. There are high transaction costs. There are other barriers that we just talked about to really channeling money from national and international levels to the communities where it's needed most. But there are innovative mechanisms and financing vehicles that can maybe aggregate smaller investments into larger packages. Can you speak to some tools and financing vehicles that show promise in delivering financing to dozens, if not sometimes hundreds, of community scale projects at the same time?
Thanks, Agnes. That's a good question, and I'm also being mindful of time, so I'll try to be quick on that one.
Yep.
So yes, there are aviation structure, and I think Ricardo talked to some of them. At the end of the day, though, and this is coming from someone that grew up in the structured finance world, I don't know that this fantasy of the aggregation platform is gonna meaningfully tip the balance, and effectively we've seen more result. It's probably going much more plain vanilla, and also really playing about this idea of perception and almost venturing into behavioral economics territory. And I'll give you two examples. And this is really to your point of local knowledge. If the knowledge is local, then we need to partner with local players, and that means that rather than telling smallholder farmers how they should adapt to climate change, maybe we should go to financial institutions that cater to those smallholder farmers and help them assess climate risk within their portfolio, so that they can design the right financial products to tend to those populations. And one way you can do that is very easy and relatively cheap from a taxpayer standpoint is literally to incentivize them to go through the journey. And ironically, some of the most successful model we've seen is we've put in place incentive structure with some of our partner financial institutions, where they would go through their own journey of subscribing to TCFD, that's a task force on climate strict disclosure, and effectively, learn how to assess climate risk, look at their portfolio, start being transparent about it. And this has been working surprisingly well. And ultimately, rather again than trying to find a solution that we're not necessarily the best player to find the solution, let's equip those players with local knowledge so that they can come up with the solution on their own. Now, that works on the premise that we are not prescriptive when we deploy concessional resources. And I think one challenge that we're having right now within the development communities is that we're probably overly top-down in the way we deploy concessional finance, and there's this expectation that by the time we design the facility, we're going to know all the market failures, we're going to design the optimal financial product, and then by magic this is all going to solve the issue. Whereas the reality is, like in most instances, as intermediary or broker of concessional finance, we don't know. As you said, the knowledge is local, and that probably means that we ought to shift a little bit how concessional finance is deployed, and rather than, for example, determining ex ante what this is going to look like, maybe be super comfortable with the idea that we don't know what this is going to look like, but we're going to judge you on the result, and we're going to give you money only if you deliver on the result. And by the way, there are models in place, I think, in the health sector, in the vaccine in particular, where that's the way funds are being deployed and channeled, and it's been arguably much more efficient and successful.
Yeah, so performance-based finance is really, really key. And it's really important that you raised as well is really the flexibility that's needed in the sector, and not a one-size-fits-all solution. I do want to encourage the audience to put in any questions that you may have to the panelists in the question and answer box. We do have a first question that I wanted to now turn to. So one of the biggest problems in lower income countries in South Asia is the regulatory framework, which is not attractive to the private sector for big investment. What steps can be taken by the LICs to attract blended financing in health and climate sector? How development partners can help in changing the regulations by reforming public financial management system of the LICs? And I think, Rick, maybe I'll turn to you, especially because this does have some overlap with what we did also want to talk about, which is these country strategies and programs that countries are putting in place in prioritizing where they want to attract investment. And obviously, regulatory framework is key. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Well, listening to the question, the first thing that came to mind, I think in the beginning when Santiago was describing my background, I do a little bit of work with philanthropic institutions, and this is actually a question that they're thinking about actively, because during the Trump era, as the U.S. government, and I'm talking about U.S. philanthropists, as the U.S. government kind of pulled out of providing concessional finance for climate purposes on the whole, right? There was kind of an effort to demonstrate that the U.S. as a global society is still in the climate fight. And so a lot of foundations started, learning and experimenting with blended finance and concessional finance and using their money that way. And that has some positive impacts. However, where it gets to the question, the lesson that they're taking away is that actually maybe one of the places where they could be more impactful with concessional money or grant money is helping identify where there are regulatory barriers, designing alternatives, and then funding advocacy to change those barriers. Because where the regulatory barriers exist, they're not there by chance, right? They're usually there because they protect an incumbency that is threatened by a different growth model that's going to be low carbon or more resilient. So, they don't go away without some real societal push and having credible alternatives. If you look at, and this goes, maybe your second point there, Agnes, if you look at NDCs as an example and compare what countries put out there on their NDCs relative to, and this is true of US, it's not just a developed country thing, and then look at what they are actually prioritizing in how they spend public money and what sectors of the economy they're protecting with regulation, there's often a mismatch, right? NDCs are varying quality. Many of them are more aspirational and very vague. They're not that useful as kind of a guiding instrument. But the real spirit of an NDC should be country ownership. It should be, this is where countries say, we own this mission, we own this remit, and we're all going to be oaring in this direction. And where that's not the case, which is in many places in the world, there are opportunities to support institutions in developing countries that can kind of push their own societies that way. And like I said earlier in an early question, I'm going to bring this back to green banks because I think this is a good example, right? So in many countries, those institutions don't exist, right? So one place where development capital or organizations like aid or philanthropies can use their capital is to help stand up these institutions that then become centers of advocacy, centers of knowledge, centers of demonstration, as well as potentially concessional money that can really drive change in the developing countries themselves and make that change much more politically durable over time, as well as ultimately financially sustainable. And where development capital could be supportive, one is actually providing the air cover that champions need in those countries to set these things up and to help these institutions grow, and then design support. and both of the institutions, but also the products and the efforts and potentially regulatory changes that they can advocate for. And then finally, they're going to need capital. So helping them think through what a capitalization strategy is, and obviously a successful one. If there's true country ownership, there'll need to be, so it's getting the game from the local economy as well.
That's great, thank you. And I think that's actually a very good summary that touched on a lot of things that we've talked about. Santiago, do you want to just wrap up? We have about 3 minutes left, so I want to give you a chance to just wrap up with some of the main topics that we touched on. But I really want to thank all of you, all of our panelists, for taking the time to speak to us. And it's wonderful to see people representing different organizations that really do need to work together, because as we noted, this is really an important topic and it needs everyone's attention, everyone's work to be well coordinated. So thank you. And Santiago, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Agnes, and thank you, Rick, Matthew, and Sashi. I think you all touched on significant top-down or strategic considerations and learnings and things that we're figuring out that we don't know, which are really critical as we try to move forward and get big money to move into this big challenge. And at the same time, you talked about some of the bottom up and frankly, industry level things. I would put in terms of how does the cement industry need to behave? How does the water sector need to behave? How does the transportation sector need to behave? And there's probably a lot of good things that are going on that are being undercounted. And there's probably a lot bigger problems that are needing to be addressed that are, probably at the local sector, at the local level. Banks and ministries are going to figure out how to do that, perhaps with our support. So thank you all for really helping to wrap our arms around this very, very complex issue. And I look forward to having other interesting and rich conversations, both in this topic as well as in other significant issues that we're trying to deal with and address and improve upon as development practitioners. So thank you all. Thank you all for have spent an hour with us. I hope that you let others know that this was a rich conversation and that they can sign on and watch this whenever they have a free hour. So on behalf of the SID Finance Committee, we look forward to seeing many of you soon. And do register for the annual conference. It's a lot of fun. Talk to you all soon. Thank you, Agnes, for moderating. And we look forward to doing this soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Cheers.